Are you stuck in the same old routine at work? Do you find yourself hitting a creative wall, unable to see beyond your current perspective? It's time to break free and unlock the power of fresh perspectives. David Gouthro, discover fresh perspectives. I've tried to find, unique ways to welcome people to the show, but after doing about 90 of them, I just said, let's just get started. So I'm here today with my guest, Tania Stilson. Welcome, Tania.
Thanks so much, David. Pleasure to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
So, Tania, one of the things that you're passionate about, I'm very curious about, is about MAID, medical assistance in dying. So I'd like to just dive into that and explore and see what I can learn. And, maybe the first thing, because I'm sure a lot of people have heard the term MAID and have different understandings of what the acronym actually means. So, but what exactly is medical assistance in dying and how does it work in practice?
Sure. A simplified way to think of MAID is medical assistance in dying is just a health service that allows someone who is found to be eligible to receive assistance from a medical practitioner to end their life. Now, obviously, there's lots of safeguards and criterias around that, but in the essence, that really is what it is.
Okay. So I'm sure there's all sorts of, ethical issues around this as well, but let's start with some other ones a little more down to earth and practical. So what are the eligibility criteria for some to access MAID?
Yeah, there's very strict criteria. And one of the important things is this is actually governed by the Criminal Code of Canada. It's that serious so that there are the safeguards. So this is not anything that is, it's actually not under the Healthcare Act, but under the Criminal Code. So the strict criteria that every person needs to be eligible for is you have to be 18 years or older and mentally competent, and you have to suffer what they quantify as a grievous and irremediable medical condition. So the specifics of that are it has to be a serious illness, disease, or disability. This isn't, you've had a bad hip for a couple days and you're recovering from surgery. It has to be a serious illness, disease, or disability. It has to be in an advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed. So let's talk about the hip surgery. We know people overall will, return to some new way of life, but it's an advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed. And the other one under the irremediable medical condition is it's the individual person has unbearable physical or mental suffering from the illness, disease, or disability that cannot be relieved under regular conditions, right? So it's how the person feels. It's how the individual quantifies suffering for themselves. So as a medical practitioner, it would be hard for me to understand what your level of suffering is in comparison to my level of suffering because I'm a baby. I don't suffer well. So it's how the person is deemed the suffering part. So those are the three components. Obviously, it has to be a voluntary request. Nobody can sign up anybody else for it. And they have to give informed consent to receive it.
So a couple of questions come to mind. And so who determines what's serious? Like, is there a list of serious diseases and who assesses that? So that's one part of the question. Another part of the question is how is mental competence assessed? So what are those two things, and then who makes those determinations?
Great. So the first step, if somebody wants to apply for MAID, and let's remember that not everybody who applies is approved. I think that's important to remember. So the first step is you apply for MAID, and you can do that either through your doctor, you can do it through I'm in Alberta, so you can do it through 911 in Alberta, but every province has the ability to apply. So once you send in the application, so to speak, it's called a record of formal request, and that has to be witnessed. That has to be witnessed by somebody, you as an individual who's choosing the application. It also has to be signed by somebody who's not a benefactor to your will, right?
Okay,
So
that makes sense.
Yeah, I've been a witness to many people. I like to have those conversations, and all it is a witness to the application. Then once the application is approved, it goes to two individual assessors who are completely independent. So a medical practitioner, so it's either a nurse practitioner or it's a doctor. And then there's a secondary nurse practitioner or a doctor that will sit with the person to find out all of the medical information. They'll go through, they'll spend some time, they'll do the background checks on what is all of the medical information. They are the two independent parties who really do a deep dive.
And the second one you said is in person. Is the first one in person, or is any of that done online?
For our case with my dad, he had his first one was online, and then the second one was in person. Ours got a little complicated, which I can go into if we want to talk about the story of my dad, but then he had to have a third assessment. So, and the third one happened to be online as well.
So, okay, so my mind's going in a pile of different directions, and
Sure.
so maybe before we go into this a little further, how did you come to MAID as something that you were passionate about or interested in? So, what's the sort of the background of the story there, and then we'll go
Sure.
into some other directions.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. First of all, my dad was very, very passionate. And that comes from a long history. That goes back to the Sue Rodriguez case that many Canadians would know. My dad always was a really strong advocate for independent choice, not just with MAID, but believed that everybody should be autonomous and have their own choice. My dad got sick with hepatitis and then had neuropathy, which is terribly painful. And during that time, he knew he didn't want to suffer. And this is prior to the legislation. So the legislation passed in 2015, came into effect in 2016, and dad was sick a couple years before that. During that time, dad discovered an organization called Dying with Dignity, which is one of the largest advocates in Canada. And he actually sat on the national board. So that was just typical of my dad. He was interested in things. And then he went out to a conference. And then lo and behold, he spent his retirement years sitting on the board of directors for Dying with Dignity. So for us, MAID was always a very regular conversation in our household, right? We talk lots about what is quality of life over quantity of life. What does that mean to you? If you don't have quality of life, what does that look like? Right? So we would have very hard conversations throughout my life, throughout growing up years, all the way through, and really open conversations about death and dying and what that looked like. And then sort of fast forward, my dad was sick for 12 years. He tried absolutely everything to remedy his illnesses. Um, and then eventually at the end of 2023, he made the decision in the fall to apply for MAID. So then he started the process. Obviously, he sent in the request. He had a friend that signed the record of request form. And funny little turn of events, he and my mom always wintered in Mexico, so they went down to Mexico. He ended up his pain was unmanageable, and then he came home, uh, phoned us in October, the end of October. Obviously a terrible call, and then they came back to Canada, and we started the process then.
So I can't help but think of that conversation that you had. You started, very very young, and
Yeah.
I'm just trying to imagine what that must have been like, because I even remember, like, years before my mom passed away, and she was having a conversation with myself and brother and sister about, well, and and who'd like this silverware, and who wants this, that, and the other thing, and I was just so uncomfortable with that conversation because I don't want any of that. Like, I don't want to be having this conversation this far in advance. And I just, it doesn't matter. I'm not looking for those kinds of things. I've talked to other people who the family has been split apart because they're deciding who's going to get what. But what were those conversations like when you were younger, and how did you get into it? And do you have any suggestions on, when and whether families should have that conversation? Like I can't imagine a lot of people do that as a matter of they've taken a parenting course, and one of the things they teach them is when to have the conversation about MAID and choices. Uh,
Well,
yeah.
yeah, I think in our culture, we don't talk about death. We tend to run away from death, right? As if it's not going to happen, right? We're disturbed by the topic, or we think, I think in our medical field as well, lots of people are like, do everything at all costs.
Mhm.
And yet somewhere in there, we have to have the conversation about, well, what is quality of life? And that's a real individual choice. And so if you know what you value in life, and I know what I'm very, driven by and value in my life, and now I can't live that life, and I have this legal medical option, then you start to have better conversations. I think overall, David, we as a society need to have better conversations. Like the punchline is you will die. We have an office dog, and poor old Bella is an older office dog, and one of my coworkers the other day was like, "It's okay, Bella, you'll be okay." And I'm like, "Well, the reality is the dog will die. The reality is I will die. The reality is you will die and your parents will die." And we don't know the order of how that's going to happen because MAID is a very scheduled process, and we walk very, you know, intentionally to that date and time on a calendar. But we better be having the conversations about death and dying much more. My parents always had those conversations.
Mhm.
My parents, when they traveled, and they traveled a lot, and I was 15, there was a big envelope on the kitchen table that said in case of death. Sure, right, with their wills, and you have to understand, we come from a family of planners, but it's like, we plan so much around our vacations, we plan about our retirements, we plan about our careers. Why are we afraid of the conversation when our parents might say, "I want to gift you this precious heirloom," and we go, "No, no, no, mom, I don't wanna take that right now," or, "No, I don't wanna have this conversation. You're okay." Like, sometimes people want to have those conversations, and they know they need to have those conversations, and I think as people age, they get better at them. But why aren't we having those conversations at every, marking in our life? My friends and family, like, I want them to have conversations around not just my things, but more importantly, what is the life that I want? Because for me, what I've discovered is death is not the opposite of life. Death
Right.
is part of life. Right? It's a season. So it's if we can view it that it is part of rather than the opposite of death isn't life. The opposite of death is birth.
You know, I yeah. I'm just, thinking about one of the reasons why people, and me being a people include me, might be uncomfortable talking about it because all those other aspects of our life we have some element of control over. And so we can have a conversation and know that we can control it. Death isn't, we can't control the when. We could certainly influence the how. But I wonder if it's because we don't feel we have the ability to control it that we don't want to talk about it. And it just, especially if we tend to be a control oriented society, want to control everything. And guess
If
what?
you wanna control everything, though, then you do wanna make death
You know
because
what?
that is controllable. You pick the day, the time, the location, who's around you, what food you wanna eat, the experience that you're going to have on that day. You
I
get to choose a good death versus a bad death, which in my eyes is if I have the choice of choosing that day, and I've walked with, my dad and other people, it's a really good death.
I would agree with that. And that's, if you are in a position to choose that. And of course, if you're choosing MAID, that's totally, in your control. It's just that, other times it may not be as much. I can totally see why, if it's MAID, that it's a better death for you and for everybody. And I've just recently come into being aware of people that are death doulas that help people through that whole experience. So it's a much more positive thing. And I think it may have been around for a while, but it's fairly new for me in just the last few years. And I think that's a really positive step towards acknowledging some of the things we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So what are some of the most common ethical dilemmas, if any, that arise around MAID?
I mean, there's a unanimous, let's remember the legislation was passed by the Supreme Court of Canada back in 2015 with a unanimous decision in favor of. This was not a political party that brought this forward. This was a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court. Most people, when you talk about, I'm going to put down my dog because it's suffering and old and aged, and we don't want to watch our dog suffer, can understand MAID in regards to what they call track one, which is defined as somebody's death is reasonably foreseeable. So that was the first part of MAID. Was they took the legislation and they said the first step of that to implement MAID would be those who death is naturally foreseeable. So
Okay.
I have terminal cancer. I've watched both of my in-laws suffer terribly from esophageal cancer and adrenal cancer. And that was pre-MAID, and all of us have those terrible stories in our family history where we don't want somebody to suffer, so we go, this makes sense. Most people would know MAID in that capacity, and most of the track one, so reasonably foreseeable, would be cancer related. The other track that came, so that was Bill C-14 on the legislation. The other track that came through, which is the track my dad falls under, is those who is suffering, but their death is not reasonably foreseeable. So they would still meet the criteria. They're over 18. Their illness is serious illness, disease, or disability. They're in an advanced state that's irreversible, and they're suffering. The only difference with the folks under track two, is they're not terminally ill. So think of conditions like chronic pain. Think of conditions like I sat with a woman last month, a lovely woman who had secondary MS, ALS, all those terrible diseases that you're going to suffer from, but maybe not. It's harder to predict whether your death is foreseeable. So I think people have a bit of a harder time, if we want to use the word ethically, but I think heartfelt wise, they may have a harder time going, oh, I understand if, Joe has terminal cancer, but I don't know if Susie with MS, even though she doesn't have the support systems or she can't feed herself, because they don't know they wouldn't choose that for themselves. And so they layer their values or their suffering view on those people and say, I wouldn't do that, therefore maybe Susie shouldn't. So I think that's a bit of a question for people. And then the future one, the next one, the one they've tabled, is probably the most complicated, and that is the sole underlying medical condition is a mental disorder. So I suffer from schizophrenia. And so my condition isn't physical, but it's solely mental. And so that's hard for people because they go, "Oh, I'm on medication. I have depression. My niece, right, this, that, and the other." And it's like, it's not about a bout of depression. Again, it has to meet all of those criteria. It has to be irreversible. It has to be serious. It has to be suffering deemed by the person. But people have a harder time of how do you determine those types of things, especially the psychologists and the psychiatrists that have to they're in the practice where everything they do, they believe that they can help somebody. So, my personal lens of that is we can't discriminate against people because their condition is solely mental. That's discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
If we're saying we're not discriminating against people now because their death isn't terminal, that the original legislation didn't discriminate. As long as it met the criteria, as long as it met the safeguards, as long as it was under the Criminal Code of Canada, then in my opinion, we shouldn't discriminate against people because their illness, disease, or disability is solely a mental condition. We've come a long way. In my lifetime, we've come a long way with mental illnesses in this country. And so at this point, I think that that's really counter to what we've said along the way of a mental illness is an illness.
Right. Well, what about, again, I just maybe this getting into the mechanics, but, what if you change your mind or what if, and I, like, I'll be using terms I don't know anything about right now.
Yeah.
I'll point us right in front, but, if someone was having a long-term, like a bipolar episode,
Mhm.
and they were at their lowest part and said, I can't stand it anymore. And then they reverse that.
Yep.
Do you have, can you call it off? I mean, how committed are you to these things? And is there such a thing as intervener status where someone else has a voice in it, or?
Yeah, great question. And yeah, no, the language is all fine because that's how people ask it. So it's all good. Yes, you can always call it off, right? As soon as once you determine your date, it's not like the MAID provider shows up at the door and says, okay, David, it's 10 o'clock on Tuesday. Let's get this thing started. That's not how it works. On the day of the provision, you have to, as the individual, this is driven by the individual all the way along. You, the individual, sends in the application. You, the individual, has the first assessment. You, the individual, has the second assessment. You, the individual, on the day of, have to sign paperwork that says this and verbally give permission that there's an understanding, right? So nowhere in there. And do people call it off? Yeah. Yeah, sometimes they do. Do people apply for MAID, get approved for MAID, and never use it? Yep. Sometimes it's just kind of feels like that, like it's the ace in my back pocket, that if something happens, I can use it. And there's a sense of peace that comes from that, that if things get progressively worse,
Mhm.
I got my, get my jail out of card free for old time Monopoly game. I have my out. And they actually have a much more peaceful time because now they're actually focused on how they're going to live versus, holy Dinah, I don't know how ugly this is going to get and what this will look like.
So there's a bunch of what ifs going through my mind,
Yeah.
and what if I have this in my back pocket, I've got approval for it, and then I say, okay, let's go. Is there another process that I have to go through, another vetting process to say, well, it was scheduled for last year and you decide not to go ahead with it. So now do we have, there have to be another evaluation or, I
Yeah,
think.
once you've been approved, right? And remember, not everybody gets approved, but once you've been approved, it doesn't expire. And often people, not often, I don't like that word. Sometimes people will postpone their date. They say, "Yep, I've been approved. I want it." And then they go, "You know what? I don't. I'm going to come see me again in 6 more months." You don't have to go through the approval process again. You don't have to have those assessors again. You get to it doesn't expire. I guess that's the only
Okay.
way I can explain that.
And I do know a couple of close friends that have gone the MAID route, 3 of them actually, and one proceeded, and 2 passed away like within days before the procedure.
Yeah.
So, and I hope this isn't. It feels like a morbid question, but I don't mean it to be. But what actually happens? So
Sure.
the person comes to the bedside. I didn't even know where to start asking the question. Like,
Yeah.
today's
Yeah.
the day, and we're going to proceed. Now what?
Yeah. So then you're making some decisions. You're going to make the decisions of, do you want to die at home? Some
Okay.
people do, some people don't. So sometimes there's facilities. There's a MAID house opening in Vancouver. There's one in
Oh,
Toronto. You go to the house, so it's not a hospitalized setting, but it's not also your home. So where do you want this event to happen? About 50-50 right now. People choose to have the, it's called provision. So people choose to have the provision or to die at home and 50% elsewhere. I've experienced both. My dad died at home in his own home with my mom, their condo. And then I supported somebody I volunteered for in a hospice in just outside of Calgary. So that's your first question.
mhm.
You know, then it's all the other questions of like, then what time do you want this provision to happen? My dad had it at, 10 o'clock in the morning because my mom was like, I don't want to wait around all day. It's
Right.
not easy to walk towards that day. It's, you got that in your lens. Other people choose any time of day. The actual day of, after they come in, there's two people that would come in. I'll talk about it as in I'm not gonna throw you under the bus. I'll talk about it as if
Throw
I
me,
actually
throw
do.
me.
Okay. So the person would come to my house and there would be two people. There would be a nurse practitioner and the nurse.
No, you know
Oh,
what? I actually would tell me like it
you
would
want
be
it?
me.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
David, what's going to happen on that day? So we know it's XYZ day. That person, we're going to have two people arrive at your home. The first person will be the nurse. The nurse will come in and they'll just set the intravenous lines, right? Because this is all done, thankfully, in Canada. This is medical assistance. This is a doctor providing this assistance. If you look into other countries like the US, it's self-administered. So
Oh,
you take a drink of, yeah, I know. 90, like all of the Canadians, it's an option in Canada. Nobody chooses a self-administered. So now the nurse arrived. She's going to put the intravenous lines. She does too, just in case. There's when dad had his at home, there was no IV pole. When we were in the hospice unit, there was an IV pole.
wow.
Then you sign the paperwork again. You give verbal recognition that you approve and you are making consciously this choice. The nurse is sort of off in the background, and now the doctor does a series of injections. The first injection is just like you're in surgery. They're just going to put you to sleep as if you were in surgery. And that's usually, and what I tell people that I volunteer with is make sure you have all of those meaningful conversations. I always suggest days before because
Mhm.
the day of is kind of, it moves, there's a process that happens. So I just felt like on our day, that's not the time you start to have the conversations, is when, when the series of injections is coming, have those conversations before. First injection, like I says, would put you, we're gonna put you, puts
Mhm.
you into a operative state, just like you're having surgery. The second injection is gonna slow your heartbeat. And then the third injection slows the rest of your organs. And then the fourth is really just so that there's, as it was explained to us, so there's no involuntary movements afterwards. So it
Okay.
it is relatively quick. I asked all of the questions with dad, like what happens to your body? You know, do we need to put rubber sheets on the bed? Is my dad's blood right? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Right? I
Yeah.
need to know all these things. That doesn't happen. Strangely, it's like, it was explained to us on the second experience that it's like sleeping. You're just gonna go to sleep. You don't ever worry about, you
Mhm.
know, wetting the bed, so that doesn't happen instantly. And it's very peaceful. It seems very quick because, um yeah, I think it's just like the line between the living and the not living is so thin that you get a real sense of that.
Mm.
But there's no response, right? They go into very, very heavy sleep. It's very relaxing. I mean, I think we all talk about so often that if I could die in my sleep, I'd love to die in my sleep.
Right. Yeah.
And that's actually what this is. So And then, of course, like my experience with the dad is different than others, but then the family feels the loss of, because as much as you're prepared for supporting your person, I think there's a real, the grief then suddenly is real. There's all this anticipatory grief, which I didn't know that word, which is why I'm passionate about what I do now and the MAID work I support, because it's like we don't know this term of anticipatory grief, or I didn't. And now the person, now my dad has passed peacefully and I support that decision, but I just lost my dad.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. It's like both my parents passed when I was on the West Coast. And, I remember going back from a meeting in Toronto. I was going to see my dad, and then he passed away literally 3 hours.
Right.
And so there's something about the grief, but there's also the sense of closure, I think, of being there. And I guess we can always have regrets of so many different types, but, you could regret not being there. I suspect there'd be less regret longer term for being there when this happened. I mean, I'm just imagining, I'm projecting here big time.
Yeah, I think every MAID experience, just like any other, I just call MAID deaths a scheduled death versus an unscheduled.
Right.
So a scheduled death has the opportunity of the knowingness. And so best get at it, right? Best have those conversations, best to have those moments. I had an absolute wonderful last day with my dad. He passed on January the 4th, and I had a great day with him on January the 1st, and he made waffles, and it's just my day of celebration with him. It wasn't even a whole day. He was also ill, so he needed naps and things, but and I wrote him a letter and read it, and we had I got to say everything I wanted to say, and we focused on the love and not the loss. And so there are all those great parts. The family knew the date and time, and so we were able, nobody missed it, so to speak, right? And so all of those parts are very lovely.
Hmm.
Uh, the counter to that, if we're gonna go, the good, the bad, and the rest of it, the bad part of that is you would look at the calendar and go, "Dad's dying in 2 weeks." We
Hmm.
watched my mom and dad were together since they were 13 and 14. I watched
Wow.
my mom losing the love of her life every day. And that was heartbreaking in the knowingness. Now, had she lost him to a heart attack, it would also be devastating, but watching her, walk, like, she's a steely woman, she is strong and supportive, but, um, I don't know what that experience would be like because 'cause I'm the daughter and not the wife, but knowingness to go, "This is our last night, this is our last morning, this is our last." I have my dad's last cup of coffee that he had with me at my house. That's, when you're so intentional about the walk towards death, that is why we need to have support for the
Mm.
individuals choosing MAID and the support system for the families choosing MAID.
So can you say a little bit about that, Tanya? Like, what does that support system look like? Like, and because I'm thinking, what about if there's someone who, is, unfortunately, homeless or poverty stricken and can't afford any kind of support whatsoever. So they decide that their way out is made, which probably wouldn't meet any of the criteria that you're
That's right.
you're you're talking about, right?
That's right.
But
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I mean,
let's unpack that because I do think people have this lens and the media sometimes take that, but let's remember anybody can apply for MAID. And
right.
so sometimes you'll see these really, unfortunate headlines that talk about that, right? That, this homeless person, applied, or this person with a disability applied, which they could, but that doesn't mean they're going to be approved. And so we don't want to conflux the two issues of that, right? So, but yeah, let's just talk about the support system. So there's two organizations in Canada. Well, I would talk about three. The first I've talked about is Dying with Dignity, and they're very good in regards to the logistics, how MAID works, as a resource, as advocacy, as training, as webinars. I would call that sort of knowledge gathering. Their MAID Family Support Society provides support for family members.
Okay.
And then Bridge C14, which is the organization I volunteer with, and is really the bridge between the medical and the provisions and the families. So we provide support, and that can look like webinars, not webinars, Zoom meetings, drop-in groups for people. Those could be people choosing MAID or thinking about choosing MAID or supporting somebody choosing MAID. And then so I would call that pre and then post. So there's grief group support for those family members who have supported a loved one with their decision through MAID. Because it is a bit of a different death. There is still some, maybe let's call it social stigma for some folks. I have a friend of mine, and unfortunately, as much as she supported her husband, the children didn't support her after he made the decision. So, that's unfortunate, but now she's found people who have also had this experience. So, Bridge C14, wonderful organization, MAID Family Support Society, and Dying with Dignity.
So and we can put these in the program notes, Tanya, but if someone wanted to find out more about MAID either from strictly a curiosity perspective, want to know what other people go through or what the process would be, if we could put some of that in the program notes so people can look for that, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what I found for me particularly. I was very much, involved in helping my dad get through, setting up the Zoom meetings and those types of things and just being the advocate. My family was very gracious of letting me sort of quarterback the logistics. But what I found was I really needed people who had had this experience of MAID. And even more so, what I found, I found a local woman whose dad had chosen MAID many years ago, and it was a very different circumstance. He was terminally ill with cancer and had multiple types of cancer. What I wanted was to hear from somebody who also was in track two, whose death wasn't necessarily it wasn't reasonably foreseeable. So I think it's kind of that me too feel as we always want in those times of unknowingness or uncomfortability to find others who have had a shared experience. And so in both MAID Family Support and Bridge C14, all of those families are volunteers who have had lived experience like AS. But you know, I get it from both sides. I get it from a longevity of being the daughter of John Warren, and I get it from having lived experience. And now I get it from supporting other people who are choosing MAID. And I really take this work it's a privileged work to be able to sit and have conversations with people of why are you considering this at this time, and let's make sure we can have those conversations. And it's so lovely to, I work with a family now who is, choosing their date, and they're walking towards it, and what do they want the service to look like, and where do they want it to be. And this other woman I supported last month, and it was just, I only knew her for a very short time. I only knew her for 13 days, and we instantly connected. And when I found out she was uncomfortable about the day, I said, I'll drive up. I'll sit bedside. I'll be with you. You don't need to, she had other folks there, but she wanted somebody who had gone through it. And it is, it's a profound experience. And she was lovely, and we had tuxedo cake, and we had, we made some really funny decisions about what we're going to eat within the hours that we met. And we never met that until that day. I only
Wow.
met Karen 3 hours before she passed, and held her hand. And we laughed, we cried, and she had a really good death. And I think of her every day.
I could imagine that, the thought of dying alone just leaves me cold. And it's nice there's someone there, even if you don't know them. And, there's so many other questions that occur to me that I won't burden you with. But, like how do different religions, think about MAID? How do other cultures deal with end of life and things like that? So many other questions. What have you learned from people that you've gone through this with? But at this point, I would like to thank you so much for being willing to have this conversation with me and for supporting other people that are going through this. It's so nice that they have the gift of your presence as they go through something like this. So thank you so very much for being here with me today, Tania. I so appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome. And I hope it inspires you to have some conversations with people around you and not be afraid of the conversation, regardless of whether it's a MAID death or not, but talk about, not about your will and estate planning, but what is it that you want from your end of life, as we all, we're all getting older, not younger. So I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with you as a friend of of one of our dear friends, Kimberly Lyle, is a past interviewee. She speaks highly of you, and I just really always enjoy the conversations about death and dying. And it was a pleasure to be here today.
So this has been David Gouthro with my guest, Tania Stilson. Please come back next week and discover some more fresh perspectives. Thank you so much. Subscribe now, because on Fresh Perspectives, every episode is an opportunity to explore new horizons and redefine what's achievable.